Okay, so now we are going to look at chapter 2 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We left off with Lucy going through the wardrobe doors, and she's feeling for the back of it, and it turns out there is no back to this wardrobe. And before you know it, she's in the forest with trees and snow, and she sees a lamppost, and she walks to the lamppost, and then she sees a mythical creature, a faun, and he's got an umbrella, and he's carrying his parcels. If you want to picture, here's some picture of parcels right there. You see, look like gifts wrapped up, and he's carrying those. And then she says hello to him, and he drops them. When he sees her, he says, "Goodness gracious me," and drops those. And now we will get into chapter 2. What Lucy found there. "Good evening," said Lucy. But the fawn was so busy picking up its parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve? My name's Lucy, said she, not quite understanding him. But forgive me, you are what they call a girl, said the fawn. Of course I'm a girl, said Lucy. You are, in fact, human? Of course I'm human, said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. How stupid of me. But I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before. I am delighted, that is to say, and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus. I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, how you came into Narnia? Narnia? What's that? Said Lucy. This is the land of Narnia, said the fawn, where we are now. All that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west? I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room, said Lucy. Ah, said Mr. Tumnus, in a rather melancholy voice. If only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know all about those strange countries. It is too late now. But they aren't countries at all, said Lucy, almost laughing. It's only back there, at least, I'm not sure. It is summer there. Meanwhile, said Mr. Tumnus, it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long, and we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve from the fair land of Spare where eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me? Okay, so Mr. Tumnus misunderstands where Lucy's from. She says she's from the spare room, and he hears spare from the place of wardrobe. He doesn't quite understand what she's saying. Also notice that he refers to her as a daughter of Eve, and I'll try to have a little video up talking about what all this means. But remember, daughter of Eve or son of Adam is a way of saying human. And so this refers to the biblical story of Adam and Eve. And in the world of Narnia, all the myths and stories from Europe, from religious sources, are all intermixed together. And we're going to continue to see that as we read. Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus invited her back to come have tea with him. Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back. It's only around the corner, said the fawn, and there'll be a roaring fire, and toast, and sardines, and cake. Okay, real quick. I know you're like, he's inviting her to come back with him, and he talks about tea, toast, sardines, and cake. And I know people, if you're like, sardines, that's like canned fish. What you must remember, this book was published 70 years ago in 1950, but it was written during the time of World War II. So remember the air raids. The Germans are bombing the British. And so life is tough. But they also, because they were fighting in the war, it was World War II, there was what was called rationing. There wasn't enough food to go around all the time, where you couldn't just go to the store and buy whatever you wanted. You had to have a card. And that card only allowed you to get enough food just to feed your family at that moment. You couldn't store up a lot of food. So for a young child, in a time when they didn't have, Starburst or Airheads or any of the candies and chocolates that we're used to, in that time to be invited to go and have toast and even canned fish and cake, which is not like the fancy cakes we think of today, but would have been a simple pastry, that would have been such a treat to a child who lived during a time of rationing. And any child who was reading this book in the early 1950s when it first came out, they would have remembered the time of rationing. And so the idea of being invited to tea time with all these things, this would have been an absolute feast and a treat for the child. Okay, so kind of imagine that. Think of being invited to go and eat popcorn and chips or candy or whatever kind of sweets that children like at this time, whatever it is you like. I know everyone has different tastes, but imagine a world where most of the time you weren't allowed to have those because they just weren't in the stores and someone had them and they're like, come and you can have a meal with me. It would have been a treat. Okay, back to the text. Well, it's very kind of you, said Lucy, but I shan't be able to stay long. If you will take my arm, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now off we go. And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood, arm in arm with this strange creature as if they had known one another all their lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. Now we shan't be long, he said, and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone with a carpet on the floor and two little chairs. One for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old faun with a gray beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus and Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? Okay, so that's a little joke there. He's got these books on the shelves. And the idea is, it's funny. It's like if you went to a house today and they had books and they might say, are ghosts real? Or do aliens exist? And in the world of Narnia, they have books about legends about men. Or a book about, is man a myth? The idea, are humans real? Because in their world, it's so rare. He's never met a human and most people haven't. So in their world, there's these legends about these people known as human beings. And there's a discussion of whether or not they're actually real. And so you're supposed to kind of read them like, that's kind of funny. And so that's a little joke explained. And now that I've explained it, it's probably not as funny. But back to the text. Now, daughter of Eve, said the faun. And really it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg lightly boiled for each of them, and then sardines on toast. Remember, guys, this is a treat. And then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. So lots of carbs, which in a time of rationing would have been a treat. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the faun began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fauns, about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag, remember that's a deer, who could give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself, and then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end. Not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really, I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes." "It's no good now, you know," said the fawn, laying down its flute and shaking its head at her very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of its nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy in great distress. Don't! What is the matter? Aren't you well? Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what is wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if its heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms round him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely shook the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be any more used, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop. Stop it at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" "Oh," sobbed Mr. Tumnus, "I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met." "Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. "No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there was ever a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" asked Lucy. "My old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture over the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this." "A thing like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch." "The White Witch? Who is she?" "Why, it is she that has got all Narnia under her thumb. It is she that makes it always winter and never Christmas. Think of that." "How awful," said Lucy. "But what does she pay you for?" "That's the worst of it," said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. "I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it asleep and then handing it over to the White Witch?" "No," said Lucy. "I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort." "But I have," said the fawn. "Well," said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. "Well, that was pretty bad. But you're so sorry for it, I'm sure you will never do it again." "Daughter of Eve, don't you understand?" said the fawn. "It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now, this very moment." "What do you mean?" cried Lucy, turning very white. "You are the child," said Tumnus. "I had orders from the White Witch that if ever I saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I've ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her." "Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't." "And if I don't," said he, beginning to cry again, "she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off and my horn sewn off and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her hand over my beautiful clove hoofs and turn them into horrid solid hoofs like a wretched horse's. And if she's extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be only a statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but please let me go home." Of course I will, said the fawn. Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way from there back to the spare and wardrobe. I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? Said Mr. Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off home as quick as you can, said the fawn. And can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. And I do hope you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, said he. Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief? Rather, said Lucy, and then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs would carry her. And presently, instead of rough branch brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden board, and all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear the voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right. Okay, so we're going to stop there. This is the end of chapter 2. I've just realized as I was reading from that text that there are some grammatical errors, and there's I think somebody typed this by hand and they left some things out. So I'm going to find a different text to put up for us to follow. Also, it's really good to have the book because there's a couple of illustrations in the book that were hand done, and when Mr. Tumnus is telling the story about the mythical creatures of the world of Narnia, there are some beautiful little drawings illustrating those stories, and I think those are important to have as well. So I'll try to find another text for us to look at. It was a bit of a longer day because it's a longer chapter, but it's very important. If there's anything that you feel like you've missed, go back and reread the text. If you read it with me and we went over some things, maybe try reading it on your own to help build that fluency, especially here at the beginning of the year. All right, that's it for now.